Hello everyone. I want to take this video to talk about antitrust and market power, in large part because it's kind of rising in importance in society and in the economics profession, because for a long time it was kind of denigrated since about the 80s. But it seems to be rising in importance again. I also wanted to highlight it because it's something that our department is kind of spinning up its capacity in, and we're putting a much greater emphasis on it. So there might be some courses that deal with some of these issues coming up sometime in the future. So, where are we heading? First, I'm going to talk about monopoly in context, kind of monopoly in the old kind of Gilded Age context, as well as like a more contemporary context and the commonalities between them. I'm also going to emphasize some of the theoretical reasons why economists generally care about monopoly and some potential policy responses that have been used in the past. And as I've done with a few different topics here, I'm going to talk about some of the history of antitrust policy in the U.S. And how it's changed over time. And then kind of near the end of this talk, I'm going to talk about the New Brandeis School of Antitrust, which is this movement that's trying to change the way that antitrust is really carried out legally. And then finally, I'm going to apply some of the things we talked about to a current merger and acquisition that is kind of going to hint towards an assignment for this week. So, it doesn't seem on the face of it as though there's all that much in common between the railroads of old and the tech platforms of today. But very importantly, they are commercial endeavors that benefit from large positive network effects. What that means is that the more people using the service, the higher value the service becomes. In the railroad, we also have to talk about high fixed capital costs, similar with ISPs in modern day. YouTube is a little different because it's a platform where it's largely based around just having a critical mass of a user base. But all of these specific aspects of these platforms or industries lend themselves to a great deal of market power, because the thing that gives the market power is also what makes the platform useful. So keep all that in mind. We're going to delve back into theory for a minute. So neoclassical economic theory tells us that perfectly competitive markets should produce economically efficient outcomes as Pareto efficient outcomes. It should maximize the sum of producer and consumer surplus, or total surplus. In practice, very few markets or no markets at all are actually perfectly competitive. So there's going to be some degree of market power. In the starkest example, we have a monopolist where there's one single producer of a good or provider of a service. And as you can see in this graph here, rather than producing where marginal cost is equal to demand, or supply is equal to demand, the monopolist can produce where the green line intersects with marginal cost, where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And that increases the size of producer surplus, but we lose the deadweight loss in total surplus terms. And so the producer may be bettered off, but society is not made better off relative to perfect competition. We can also think about there being a continuum of outcomes between perfect competition and monopoly, because if there's, say, monopolistic competition where there are some producers of a good but not just one and not many, will lie somewhere between the monopoly outcome and the competitive outcome. There's also a analogous graph. If you've taken a labor economics course, you may have seen this, the monopsonistic labor market model, where basically rather than there being a single producer of a good or service, there's a single purchaser of an input of production. Typically, we're going to be talking about labor, and that also creates some deadweight loss. And so market power is also something on the buyer side as well as the seller side. And in that case, and also in the case for markets for outputs, we usually are going to be talking about markets that lie somewhere between a monopolistic outcome and a perfectly competitive outcome. So, we've identified a market where there's a monopolist or there's a great deal of market power that isn't a monopolist. What can we do? Well, what the first kind of thing that we can think about is to just do nothing. This is often the tact that is taken these days, and it's the large media companies are one example where the DOJ has not been able to successfully intervene in mergers and acquisitions that increase market power in that realm. Another option is to regulate the activity of the monopolist or other large firm. This is often done in the case of natural monopolies like public utilities, electrical companies, water companies, things like that. Bell Telephone is another classic example that was allowed to remain a monopoly for decades and decades and decades, but their pricing was heavily regulated by the federal government. Insofar as electrical companies go, generally speaking, there's usually going to be a state commission that regulates the electrical companies, and that state commission has to approve all price increases. This is because oftentimes there's only a single electrical company that has lines to individual consumers, and so they have a great deal of market power there. And the commission, often these are railroad commissions in western states, regulate the pricing that the electrical companies can do. Another option is to break up large firms, and this is what maybe conjures images of Teddy Roosevelt. But this is what the tactic that was taken largely in the past. And the idea is that these large firms are able to compete in unfair ways. They're able to kind of cross-subsidize and drive out small entrants into the market. And so if we break them up and make them smaller, then the markets will be more competitive. This is what they eventually did to Bell Telephone as well. And so these are all different kind of policy responses that we can use in different circumstances. In early antitrust, it really has its roots in the Sherman Act, which was passed not long after the Civil War. So initially, this act was not really used much against large firms. In fact, it was mostly used against unions, because unions were seen as establishing a monopoly in the supply of labor. But it was eventually heavily used in the Progressive era. Theodore Roosevelt first used it against large trusts. Trusts were, we can think of as corporations today. And his approach was to use the antitrust law, the Sherman Act, to directly control the large trusts. But he was ultimately not very successful in doing this. The next iteration came with Woodrow Wilson's administration, and that was kind of in conjunction with some legal decisions that heavily involved Justice Brandeis, who will come up again. And Wilson and Brandeis were staunchly against concentrated power publicly and privately. So they did not take Teddy Roosevelt's tact of controlling the large monopolies directly, but rather sought to simply break them up to reestablish competition. So, in subsequent decades, additional acts were passed. The Clayton Act defined some specific prohibited activities that firms were not allowed to do, and importantly, it also exempted unions from the antitrust law. The Federal Trade Commission Act created the FTC and also prohibited specific anti-competitive practices. And finally, the Federal Reserve Act, which was very important for other reasons, also managed competition between financial institutions. So these were all different acts that were meant to supplement the original Sherman Antitrust Act. So in subsequent decades after Wilson, the antitrust approach kind of solidified and became almost this like nonpartisan issue. It wasn't heavily contested. So the idea was that we would prohibit vertical integration and regulate pricing when it comes to natural or network monopolies. So, for instance, electrical companies. We would require that large manufacturers have a couple of competitors, so 2 to 3 competitors, so that we wouldn't have a highly concentrated manufacturing sector. But other than that, in other parts of the economy, much more aggressive antitrust actions were taken. So we kind of tolerated market power in these couple instances, but everywhere else it was very kind of strictly enforced. And the guiding principle of this was something called the rule of reason. And it's a very loose rule that just simply says a combination is only unlawful if its effect was an, quote, unreasonable restraint on trade. Now, there's no strict legal definition as to what an unreasonable restraint of trade is, so this left a lot of purview for judges to make special purpose decisions meeting the circumstances, and also to very broadly interpret that into multiple important arenas, including labor markets, consumer welfare, but also other social implications of monopoly. But this all kind of changed in the early 80s with Bork in his book in 1978, and so it took a few years for this to kind of be adopted. And this book really would become the entire basis of modern antitrust. And Bork's idea was to essentially kind of make this a more technocratic exercise. Economic theory was to be the guiding principle, and we should only make decisions based on consumer welfare. So if a merger or acquisition increases consumer welfare, it should be allowed to pass through. If it decreases consumer welfare, it should be blocked. But importantly, he argues that to achieve maximum consumer welfare, we should promote efficiency. This was taken later to mean that large firms that may combine could benefit from increased returns to scale and provide even lower prices to consumers. It also took a lot of the subjectivity of the rule of reason out of play, so it became this very scientific calculus that left little purview for labor or social concerns. And so this is when the Consumer Welfare Standard, or CWS, came to just replace the rule of reason outright. So, Consumer Welfare Standard states that a given merger or acquisition is only illegal if it reduces consumer welfare. That is, put in other terms, it reduces the quantity supplied or increases the price. The presumption became that mergers and acquisition could increase efficiency due to what I mentioned previously, that larger firms may benefit from economies from scale. And so all that a firm need to do to successfully argue for a merger or acquisition is to make a case that prices will not increase, and they're able to successfully defend the antitrust suit. So this kind of narrowed the purview of antitrust law and led to a great increase in market concentration in many industries. Markups are one way of measuring market power, so the amount that firms are able to charge on top of their costs of production. They've increased since the Consumer Welfare Standard became part of legal precedent. It's also important to remember that there are other kind of second-round social concerns that the rule of reason may be allowed us to think about that the Consumer Welfare Standard does not. For instance, if there's increased market concentration, it makes it less able for other people to start firms because it's more difficult to start because other firms have large benefits from economies of scale. And maybe even more importantly is that large firms are able to gain political influence through lobbying. And so they can lobby to get laws that benefit them, that prevent entry into their market and also protect their profits, for instance, through lowering corporate tax rates. And so, in this way, bigness itself could be bad just due to these potentially negative social consequences. And it's also important to remember that people are not just consumers. The consumer welfare standard only looks at consumers, but people are also workers and citizens. So we should possibly consider these other potential effects of mergers and acquisitions that increase market concentration on the labor market and also the political sphere. So this brings us to the New Brandeis movement, which is kind of an attempt to move away from the consumer welfare standard. It's named after Justice Brandeis, but it's a relatively recent movement. It's made up of a bunch of legal and economic scholars, activists that are all pushing for a broader anti-monopoly agenda. And philosophically, it really recognizes this link I was talking about between political and economic power. And really, that follows to some guiding principle that large concentrated power is incompatible with democracy. And this is very consistent with the philosophy of Wilson and Justice Brandeis that led to the rule of reason. So, Tim Wu is one of the big proponents of this approach. This is his book here. He lays out some tenets of the New Brandeis movement very clearly. One, anti-monopoly is a key tool and underpinning for structuring society on a democratic foundation. Once again, this is explicit recognition of the relation between economic and political power. Anti-monopoly is broader than antitrust, so that means that we're not simply breaking up large firms. We can regulate their behavior. We can help promote competition in other ways that may not be specifically through blocking or allowing mergers or acquisitions. Anti-monopoly doesn't necessarily mean that big is bad. If we look back when the rule of reason kind of existed, we did still have large firms, for instance, Bell Telephone, that was allowed to continue because it provided a large benefit to consumers, and its actions were heavily regulated. And finally, anti-monopoly must focus on structures and processes of competition and not outcomes. So, for example, it means you can't have some single criterion that says this goes up good, this goes down bad, like the consumer welfare standard. We need to think about the structures of individual markets. So, for instance, in markets where there's large fixed capital costs or large network effects, maybe trying to promote competition isn't necessarily the solution there, because there's a high benefit to consumers from having these positive network effects. I mean, for instance, if social media platforms were more competitive, it would provide less value overall because there would be fewer people on each individual platform. And just to wrap things up, the New Brandeis adherents argue that there's no such thing as natural market forces. So this essentially just states that market forces are determined by law and policy, and so we can legally and socially set the rules of the market to incentivize innovation while limiting private control of those markets. And so I think that the New Brandeis movement puts a kind of a new spin on the rule of reason and points us towards an antitrust law that's based on kind of more secure foundations that are consistent with other social goals. So, just to wrap things up, let's talk about the AT&T and Time Warner merger. This merger began in 2016, where AT&T set up a deal to acquire Time Warner, just becoming this immense media distribution and production conglomerate. Each of these corporations own a bunch of subsidiaries. Here, for example, you can see that Time Warner has HBO and Warner Brothers, but there's many, many, many others. It's too many to really go into here. So you've got telecom acquiring media companies. So I'm not really going to come to any conclusions here, but I am going to just ask a lot of annoying questions. One, think about, is this an example of vertical or horizontal integration, thinking back to maybe what those mean from your principles class. The deal was eventually allowed to go through in 2018. So if we think about this in terms of the consumer welfare standard, how could this be more efficient for consumers that the producers and distributors of media are now under one roof? And how might prices increase or decrease based on this? I think it's very important here to think about it in terms of net neutrality, which has kind of already been degraded over the years. But this does create a great incentive for AT&T to privilege its own content over other content creators, which is in and of itself an anti-competitive practice. And so it could make it even more difficult for small media producers to compete. And thinking more broadly, we should also consider the political, cultural, and labor and consequences of this kind of beyond the consumer welfare standard. So, does this firm becoming larger make it more capable of political lobbying to further increase its kind of market power and its profits? And I think particularly when it comes to news and media companies, we should think about cultural implications. Is it important in a democracy to have many different sources of kind of cultural promotion and development? And finally, what implications does this have for labor? Will this maybe increase or decrease the wages of the workers that work for Time Warner and for AT&T? It's difficult to say. So those are just some questions I would invite you to think about when it comes to this, and think about if, because this merger was allowed to go through still under the consumer welfare standard, do you think this merger would have been allowed to go through if a more new Brandeisian approach were taken? So keep all that in mind. So just wrapping up. Antitrust cases of old have a new relevance in modern day with all of these tech platforms that benefit from these large network effects, and thus they essentially kind of have the goal to become monopolies. The implementation of antitrust has changed a lot over the years, but the guiding principle is still based on the consumer welfare standard that popped up in '78 with the Antitrust Paradox book. The new Brandeis School is trying to offer an alternative to this that looks at many different areas. And it also emphasizes the role of underlying structures rather than simply a single outcome, which allows us to have a lot more kind of nuanced approach to antitrust than the consumer welfare standard, for instance. And so, despite this kind of new entrant into this debate, the new Brandeis School, the consumer welfare standard still reigns supreme, and that's what is kind of still guiding legal decisions, including important recent ones like this AT&T Time Warner merger. All right, that's all I got for this one. Thanks for listening, and that's it.